Hi, folks. I'm coming to you again, this time to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. I realize that we haven't talked about it yet in class. However, I know a number of you are out due to illness, etc. So I thought I'd sort of jump the gun, as it were, and post this analysis, discussion, thoughts, however you want to term what I'm going to be talking about here. So I just posted to this week's folder, week three, the Spark Notes to the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is going to be really helpful in terms of keeping the characters, um, keeping abreast of the characters, and because of course this is a Sumerian text, and it's some of the names are perhaps difficult, etc. So that's provided there for you. It also gives the sort of Spark Notes treatment of the text, which isn't altogether bad, and it might give you some insight into how you want to approach the text. But let's think about this text here. So I really hope that you were able to watch the 45-minute video on the Epic of Gilgamesh. It really delves deeply into why this text has been so revered, and people have struggled with it and come to it in times of great grief in their lives and so forth, and times of searching and inquiry and unease in their lives. And of course, great poet Yusuf Komunyakaa is featured in there, as well as Jim Starlin, who, if you are unaware, created, for those of you who are MCU fans, right? Jim Starlin created Thanos. I got to exchange maybe 3 words with him at a Comic-Con one time. But anyway, so and of course he grounds he places the Epic of Gilgamesh in a continuum of superheroes, as it were, these larger than life figures, in many cases endowed with divine attributes, as is said repeatedly in the Gilgamesh tale. 2/3 God, 1/3 man, and so on. So people are drawn to this text, arguably because, well, we can kind of see ourselves in Gilgamesh to a great degree, even though we don't have, the tremendous strength of Gilgamesh and so forth. Gilgamesh is incredibly flawed, right? The whole impetus of the story is that Gilgamesh is just really causing a lot of upheaval, right? He's the king. He has all this power and so on and so forth. He has established the walls of Uruk, and he's got one of the greatest cities in the world, and so on and so forth. But he loves throwing his weight around. He's quite a bit of a narcissist, and he's really a bully, as it were. Um, and so the gods are, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? So Uru, goddess creates a double of Gilgamesh in the form of Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is essentially identical to Gilgamesh, except he is covered in hair, and he is wild. So he is our second of our hairy sidekicks, our first having been Esau in the Jacob and Esau tale. So here we have Enkidu, and I thoroughly enjoy the character of Enkidu, because we get this picture of this trapper out, in the wilderness, and seeing Enkidu, and is a little bit bothered by this wild person, out there living amongst the animals and so forth, and goes and tells his father about it. Father says, "We'll go talk to Gilgamesh." So Gilgamesh, of course, says, "We'll go to the temple of Ishtar and find Shamat, who's one of the temple priestesses, and she'll take care of it." So, interestingly enough, and again, looking at this, thinking about the value system that this, communicates. We have Shamat, excuse me, Shamat. Shamash is the sun god. Shamat is the temple priestess. She, makes love to Enkidu for 7 days. The Stephen Mitchell version, which takes some liberties, because there are some um, um, holes in the text. Uh, you know, so Stephen Mitchell takes a little bit of poetic license in some places, but he Enkidu makes love to her for 7 days, and what happens is he loses his animal scent, if you will, and takes on the scent of Shamash, and he begins to begin. I mean, she shaves him up, right? So he looks not only human but rather attractively so, and then she takes him to over where the humans hang out and says, and they're partaking of beer, and she says, well, if you go and you drink with these people, you will be completely human. So he does that, and interestingly, so we essentially have, and I'm not arguing for or against this, but we essentially have the picture of human behavior as one who makes love for 7 days and then proceeds to drink beer. I mean, this is a dream of many people probably. I mean, what more to what more to do some people um, one of life. So, but anyway, that is indicated as human behavior. So then Enkidu hears of the trespasses of Gilgamesh, right? The particular incident that he's really the most incensed about is that he comes upon a wedding, and and everything, and the wedding is this beautiful wedding and so forth, and the bride is expected to wait in her bridal bed for Gilgamesh to essentially be the her first sexual partner, and the statement is the hymen belongs to the king. Of course, Enkidu is outraged by this. To his credit, it's kind of infantile, I believe, to place such value on ring of tissue. But we'll get in more into that as we get into some of our other texts. But anyway, he wants to confront Gilgamesh, and of course, this is your great. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a great buddy. It's really your one of your first buddy pieces of literature. Of course, we're talking about. I believe Stephen Mitchell says 1700 BCE. Some sources say 1500. Anyway, it's incredibly old, right? The Vedas probably predate it, depending on how you want to date and whose dating you're going to believe. But it's a very old text. In any case, here we have in this very old text, we got this great buddy thing, and then we get this great male this display of quintessential maleness, if there is such a thing, right? Where they start out fighting one another, and then in the midst of fighting, it's almost a kind of foreplay, because in the midst of fighting, they're like, "Oh, you're so great, you're so great. Oh, let's be best friends now, right?" And this is like a stereotypical male socialization piece, right? Um, Incident, so yeah, then they decide that they're going to be best friends. And again, remember, Shamash had told Enkidu to Shamat had told Enkidu to embrace Gilgamesh as a husband would embrace a wife. Now, of course, there's some homoerotic overtones there. and a lot has been made of this, in fan fiction, and so on and so forth. More than one piece has been written about Gilgamesh and Enkidu, doing their thing. And is this homoerotic? Certainly it is, but you know, we also have to think about affection between men, within the context of this being an ancient text, and there wasn't so much of prohibition on that sort of thing as there would be depending on what social norms one um, subscribes to, So, but in any case, Gilgamesh then gets this idea: hey, Enkidu, let's go and kill Humbaba, the guardian of Enlil's cedar forest. Now, we're going to see in a lot of the works that we're looking at, particularly the Ramayana, right? We're going to see Ram being, we're going to see, and I don't know if I'm going to have you actually read this portion of it, but Vishvamitra I believe it's Vishvamitra, Vishvamitra or Vashishta, a lot of V names in the Ramayana. But anyway, the sage comes and he asks Dasara to send his sons out with him to kill the demon in the forest, and so on and so forth. But the difference there is that the motivation for Ram in the Ramayana is dharma, this idea of duty or calling. Calling is closer to the real meaning of that, but it's often translated as duty. But in here with Gilgamesh, this is sheer glory, right? He wants the glory, and Enkidu's like, I don't think it's such a good idea, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, Gilgamesh wins out because he's beautiful and charming, and so on and so forth. And anyway, they this they really remind me. Enkidu and Gilgamesh really remind me of Robin Big. If y'all watch The Adventures of Robin Big on MTV, used to be on MTV, and I used to tell my young women students, if you ever want to understand male psychology, and how men really are, close male friends really are, when only in their own company, watch Robin Big, because the whole because in a sense Robin Big are in the Enkidu and Gilgamesh scenario, because Rob doesn't have superpowers. Neither Rob nor Big have superpowers, but they have an MTV budget, right? Which is like a superpower. It's like in the DC movie. Um, I think it's Batman versus Superman. Flash turns to Batman and says, what's your superpower? And he says, I'm rich, right? So anyway, so in the course of Robin Big, to make a long story short, if they say, oh, I want to go buy a time machine. Well, okay, they get on a plane and they go across the country and they buy a time machine. In other words, they have no limits, right? No limits imposed on them, so they can basically enact their male friendship in all of its glory, if you will, however they see fit, and that's what you have, particularly with the Umbaba episode in Gilgamesh. And so ultimately, they do, subdue Umbaba, and it's kind of again, Gilgamesh is not the nicest guy, right? Umbaba, begs for his life and so on and so forth. And Gilgamesh says, no. and Umbaba is also, the important, the head deity, right? Enlil, right? He actually had appointed Umbaba as the forest guardian, but that Gilgamesh doesn't care about that, right? And then ultimately, Ishtar takes notice of him, and you have this interesting, and I would venture to guess that contemporary readers, in other words, when this text, contemporary with the original tellings of this text, right, they would have found this hilarious, right? There's a little bit of sacrilege here. Just a little bit, kind of healthy ribbing of one's sacred. So a little bit of iconoclasm, in other words, here. So Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar, she approaches Gilgamesh to be her lover and ultimately her husband. And he says, "No, you do away with all your husbands, right? You do, look at what you did to poor Tammuz, And actually, that's why it's funny, because it's essentially glossing over this really detailed episode. Doesn't It's a reference, it's a veiled reference to a very detailed episode where Ishtar actually goes to the underworld to retrieve Tammuz and so on and so forth. And it's actually quite loving episode. But anyway, Gilgamesh is just putting his spin on it. It's like, oh, look at what you did to this guy, and so on and so forth. So of course she's slighted by this human. So what's she gonna do? So she goes to her parents and says, "Give me the bowl of heaven," and you know. So ultimately they do, and there's this whole thing about, well, did she make the proper preparation? Yes, yes. So she gets the bowl of heaven. Um, Same thing happens essentially. Gilgamesh and Enkidu subdue the bowl of heaven, but the gods decide ultimately one of them's got to die, and of course it's not our man Gilgamesh, because he is three quarters god, and his mother's a god, and so on. So we can't take him out, even though he's the ass, right? We can't take him out. So Enkidu falls ill, and it talks about him, having this feathered like appearance, and there's in the various dream sequences in the story there, Gilgamesh has a dream about the feathered dead and so on, and death is not a pleasant place. It's very akin to, say, Sheol in the Hebrew conception of death and afterlife. It's very akin to the afterlife in the Odyssey and the Aeneid, for example. The Greco-Roman view of the afterlife. It's not a great place, not a great state of being, and of course, and you have all these several dream interpretation sequences throughout, and so bottom line is that Enkidu dies, right? And Gilgamesh mourns him and really hopes he's going to come back to life until he sees a maggot. This is a great image in the video. They talk about this, right? And sees a maggot come out of his nose, right? So then at that point he can't deny that he's dead, right? So then this becomes a central question, then, right? If and we'll see this come up time and time again in a lot of the pieces that we're looking at, right? Um, if Enkidu can die, if Enkidu's going to die, Gilgamesh says, well, that means that I'm going to die. And it's like, well, what does it mean to die? What does it mean to live? You know, is there a pathway to immortality? And he's, of course, he's Gilgamesh, and he's part god and all these kinds of things, and he's the king of Uruk and everything, right? And so he's like, oh yeah, I had this relative Utanapishtim, and he actually used to be mortal, and now he's not. So I want to go find Utanapishtim, and I want to figure this out, right? I'm Gilgamesh. I am the narcissistic be all end all, right? So if Utanapishtim can become immortal, I can too. So he sets off to find Utanapishtim, and ultimately, he encounters scorpion men. The apparently there's a tavern keeper up on top of him. He goes up on top of a mountain. There's a tavern keeper there. He encounters the the the, the boatman for he's got some the boatman's got some stone men, and Gilgamesh is ticked off, and so he breaks up the stone men, and he has like, well, we needed the stone men to move the boat, so he says, well, if you cut down so many cedars and whatever, and we make poles to help move the boat, I'll get you. So anyway, he goes and he ultimately meets Utanapishtim, his ancestor. And so what's interesting here, and this really revolutionized when the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered and translated and so forth. This really revolutionized scholarship because it gives a flood story that pretty much parallels the Noah story, although it is significantly older. And so, and of course, and it's also a whole lot more detailed. And I would gather that Utanapishtim, based on the narrative, again, based on the character in the literature, not on someone who did or did not actually live, but based on the character in the literature, he's a slight bit nicer than Noah, really. But for one thing, all the artisans and so forth that are involved in the construction of the boat, they get to go, right? They get to go with the boat, and it's interesting too. You have this Promethean-like character, and by Promethean, I'm talking about the god Prometheus in Greek myth, who gives fire to humanity, thus aiding humanity. You have this god Ea, who's a water god. I mean, he is the benefactor of humanity. The head deity Enlil, he doesn't like humans very much. He's kind of tired of them, and he's ready to write them off, and so he tells the gods, the sea that he's gonna off them, right? He's gonna cause a flood, and Ea just kind of whispers it, so that Utanapishtim can hear, So Utanapishtim kind of gets, on the sly, kind of gets knowledge of what's going on. So, and then of course you have the boat and all these things, and more or less it follows the Noah tale, right? With letting out the birds, and the birds come back, and so on and so forth. Well, after the flood subsides, and of course it's in Gilgamesh version, it's only 7 days. But anyway, Enlil shows up, and he's not happy with this, right? He's not happy. I thought I wanted to kill all the humans. What is all this? And it's actually quite funny. It's like, well, I didn't tell them. I just whispered it, and they heard me. They heard me, which kind of brings me to, slight aside here for a moment. It brings me to preface to lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. In that piece, and I believe it was 1800, I believe they said poetry is not meant to be heard; it's meant to be overheard, right? So this is the Aya argument. He's like, well, I didn't tell them; they overheard me. And we might think that's trivial and so forth, but that's actually been used in court, right? That's how the all of the heavy metal trials, right? The Satanic Panic heavy metal trials. That's how none of those bands, rightfully so, none of those bands, went to prison or anything of that nature, had to pay all these fines and whatnot, because they said that the bands were creating art and so forth, and no one that's being spoken to in those songs or talked about in those songs is not actually the listener. It's actually someone that they're speaking to that is off stage, if you were, if it were. So, which also, of course, brings me to Chris Rock. Um, talking about, and again, because the same thing can be said about hip hop. Well, this hip hop song, they're saying this, and this, and this, and this, and someone who loves hip hop but who really dislikes, certain kinds of misogyny and so forth, which hopefully everybody does dislike misogyny, but they can say, well, you're not talking about me, which according to Wordsworth and Coleridge, they're not. But anyway, that's also the Aya argument, right? So, but anyway, Enlil kind of decides that he is going to, um, rather than just sort of deal with this whole conundrum and whatnot, and he just decides to make Utnapishtim a god. So Utnapishtim and his wife were both made gods. But interestingly, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that his life is far better than the vast majority of mortal beings. So he should really just enjoy his life and really imbibe um, the present, right? In a way, you know, in a kind of a backdoor way, if you will, this is a similar notion to the notion of the kingdom of heaven is at hand, i.e., if one can experience eternity not as a place per se, but as a state of being, such that one, in that state of being, in that state of mind, one is outside of time, as it were. If Gilgamesh is able to really experience and take in the joy of the present moment, does it really matter ultimately that he's going to die? You know, and as far as Gilgamesh is very linearly minded, right? He wants glory, he wants all of this, and Utnapishtim is basically telling him, you've already got that. You are the dude. Everybody knows who Gilgamesh is, and incidentally, everybody still knows who Gilgamesh is in the 21st century. You know, which is a type of longevity. So that's actually quite apropos. But so we move along, and Utnapishtim's wife essentially kind of do something to help out the poor kid. So Utnapishtim tells him, well, there is a plant that you can get. It's a spiny plant, and tells him where to go get it in the ocean and everything. And he says, if you eat this plant, it will then grant you immortality, right? So ultimately, and of course I'm leaving out quite a bit of detail. This is a great piece. I mean, listening to the audiobook, if you listen to the audiobook online, I give you a link to it. It's only a couple hours, right? It's I would say it's a great investment, because it's dealing with these great questions, and these fundamentally human questions, like, you know, what does it mean to die? What does it all mean? Period. What is human life? What's the purpose of human life? What is why should we live? Continue to live when we experience so much grief and so much loss and so much suffering. Um, so Gilgamesh ultimately, because he's hero, so he gets the plant, but he kind of pulls a little bit of a Orpheus or a Lot's wife moment, right? He gets tired, and so he kind of lays the plant down, because he had this great plan. He's like, well, I'm gonna take this back to Uruk, and I'm gonna give some to an old dude, and see what happens. And if it actually does, grant him immortality, then I'm gonna eat some. But what happens is, of course, our old friend from the Garden of Eden, the serpent shows up. The serpent, snake, eats it, and of course the snake slips out of its skin, and that again, that's a an emblem of sort of regeneration and so forth. The snake shedding its skin, but Gilgamesh is really forced to reckon with this, the reality of, okay, I've tried to become immortal. That hasn't worked. So how am I going to let the rest of my life that's without Enkidu, and so on and so forth. How is I going to have meaning, And ultimately, and he doesn't really say this, but the reader, of course, I'll say me as a reader, when I look at it, I'm like, yeah, Gilgamesh, and how are you not going to be an asshole? I mean, how are you going to essentially be a grown up here? You know, how are you going to mature? How are you going to be a grown up? What is the difference here? And so he ultimately, he takes Utanapishtim's advice, and also other characters in the story periodically give him other advice as well. Give him the same advice as well. It's repeated a couple times. But but yeah, he just begins to the appreciate what he has, and appreciate the his own, the circumstances that he has, and thereby um, he we're left with the notion that perhaps he achieves a degree of happiness. You know, um, because, and this is a kind of a Buddhist concept, and we'll touch on some Buddhist literature a little bit later with the Journey to the West, which is a Buddhist comedy. But anyway, uh, the idea that suffering is the fire of suffering, if you will, is fed by constant hankering after stuff, right? And so Gilgamesh, and this is not just a Buddhist concept, it's also, we'll see it in the Bhagavad Gita as well. Bhagavad Gita, of course, predates Buddhism, but anyway, uh, Gilgamesh, kind of manages to become satisfied with what he has. Now, you and I look at that and goes, well, he's got a hell of a lot, so that's easier for him than it would be probably for some of us. But you know, but you see how these questions that are raised in this tale really still reverberate with us today. You know, and that's why people arguably keep coming back to this. You know, the loss of a dear friend or lover and or both. And how do you make meaning for yourself, for your life after tragedy? You know, these are powerful questions, and it isn't necessarily tied up in a neat little bow. I mean, you can we can make inferences that Gilgamesh ends up happy at the end or whatever, but um, he could have also um, he could have also become discontented again. Um, it's kind of in the vein of like a reader response criticism kind of thing. In reader response, the idea is that it the privileges what the reader brings to the text, understanding and acknowledging that we each will read each and every text differently, and you will even read it differently from different day to day, because we bring different experiences, different moods, different, to a text when we read it, right? And so, one reader might, view that rather abrupt ending, as, oh well, of course, he goes off and he manages to be happy, blah 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 blah. But somebody else might say, well, maybe he's happy for a little bit, but you know, maybe not, maybe not forever. For example, Alfred Lord Tennyson's Ulysses. So in for Tennyson, very Victorian Tennyson, right? He for him, he can't have Ulysses, i.e., Odysseus. Same, Ulysses is the Latinate version of Odysseus. He can't have Odysseus, just hanging out with Penelope and growing old on Ithaca. He's got to have Odysseus um, get back in the thick of it and go out and explore again. You know, to to seek, to find, and not to yield. Because that was the Victorian British Victorian mentality of we've got to uh, conquer this world, conquer this earth, etc., for Queen and country and God, and the sun never sets on the British Empire, etc. So Odysseus, Ulysses becomes an emblem for that, and it's like a revisionist reading of the original Odyssey, which we'll get to later in the semester. But the whole idea is that Tennyson reading that, he couldn't just have Odysseus rest, that it didn't compute for him. So some people might read Gilgamesh, just kind of chilling and enjoying the rest of his life. Some people might think, well, there's no way Gilgamesh stayed in place for one. He's not that smart. Something's going to come up. But anyway, so it's just we see what's going on. But my hope is that in reading this, you're able to really feel the depth of emotion in there, particularly in the exchanges between Enkidu and Gilgamesh, and in Gilgamesh's lament over the loss of Enkidu. Okay, I've probably rambled on enough, and so I will check with you all in class. And yeah, again, like I said, use these videos as supplements to what we talk about in class. A lot of it's probably going to be repetitive somewhat, but if you happen to miss class or you want to go back over maybe and think about something that I said in preparation for writing your reading journal, things like that, hopefully these videos will be a good resource for you. Okay, I will see you all later.